everyone. You're listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast in which philosophers, theologians, and literary critics discuss how literature can help us think more deeply about love, happiness, and meaning in human life. I'm your host, Jennifer Frey. I am an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Jen Frey, and I'm on Instagram at Professor S. Frey. You can also follow this podcast on Twitter. Our handle there is at Eudaimonia Pod. In this episode, I speak with Jessica Hooten Wilson of the University of Dallas about John Kennedy Toole's A Confederacy of Dunces and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Sacred and Profane Love. I am really excited to be joined by Jessica Hooten Wilson this evening. Jessica is a professor at the University of Dallas, and she's a writer, and she's a regular on this podcast. I believe that she did episode 14 with us on Walker Percy and Love in the Ruins, and then she also did a Patreon's episode on Battle of the Classics. It's always wonderful to have you on, Jessica.
Thank you. Well, I'm actually a listener and I'm not just a guest. I love your podcast. So.
Yay. Well, we love you. So we're really glad to have you on. And I'm just, this episode has been like a dream of mine for at least a year now. So I'm just giddy with excitement because tonight we're going to be talking about two weird texts. The first being Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and the second being John Kennedy Toole's A Confederacy of Dunces. So I want to start with Confederacy of Dunces. So let's just start at the obvious point, and that is, who was John Kennedy Toole?
Yeah, so John Kennedy Toole has an interesting story himself. He was a student of medieval and Renaissance literature, and then he went on to be a professor of literature at, I think it was the Loyola University of Lafayette. Yeah, he has kind of a mixed relationship with his Catholic upbringing. His mother, Thelma, is quite a character, very closely related to the actual mother character in this work as well. And he just had a spotty publishing track record. His book was really good, but nobody was kind of latching on and publishing it. And I don't know if that's what haunted him, but eventually he committed suicide before seeing the publication of the book. And so it's kind of this dark opening to the book to realize its context about the author. But the book itself is so funny. It's difficult to imagine the author, you know?
Yeah, the book is hilarious. Yeah. I mean, this book is like, first, this book is so absurd. Yeah. Like, but it's genius.
I love it.
I mean, every character in this novel is absurd. There's not a normal person within miles of this story. The story is absurd. And there are just so many times when I just, it's like you're sitting in a room reading and then you're just cracking up and everybody's looking at you. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but it's just hilarious.
And you also can't read it out of context. Like when you laugh at a part and then you try to read just that line, it's like, you're not going to get just the line. Like you have, it's scenes, it's episodes that are really funny. Like you need the whole setup.
Well, none of it makes sense without the central character, who is, of course, Ignatius J. Reilly. So let's talk about Ignatius or Gloria. And I mean, this has to be one of the most memorable characters, I think, in all of literature. And if I had to describe him, I would say he's like a mix between Don Quixote and Archie Bunker.
Oh, I love
that. What? He's hard to describe.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Ignatius.
Sure. Well, I didn't ever see it, but Nick Offerman actually performed a play adaptation of A Confederacy of Dunces. So in my head now, when I read this, I imagine Nick Offerman playing Ignatius Reilly. Like that's who my cast is now for Ignatius. So yeah, Ignatius is called Don Quixote by Walker Percy, who actually helped the book get published, because after John Kennedy committed suicide, Thelma brought the text to Percy. So that's kind of the famous legend behind the publishing of the novel. And then Percy brought it to his local publisher, right? And then, of course, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it was this crazy story. But Ignatius opens it. A green hunting cap squeezed the top of the fleshly balloon of a head. The green ear flaps full of large ears and uncut hair, and the fine bristles that grew in the ears themselves stuck out on either side like turn signals indicating two directions at once. And then he has that bushy black mustache with crumbs of potato chips in the corner of it. And he has those blue and yellow eyes. So everything about him is almost a caricature, right? It's larger than life. It's extreme. It's everything is overflowing. Like he overflows in chairs when he sits in them. He's protruding out of his own clothing. So everything is just large feeling when you read
He's
the novel.
also very gaseous.
Yeah. The balloon head. I mean, it like sets it up like he's full of hot air, right? Like his head is described as a balloon when it opens.
Yes, and he's always talking about his valve. What is his valve exactly?
Well, I mean, it seems like he's a hypochondriac. It's not that the valve has a whole lot of reality, but in the same way that I think sometimes we talk about our sicknesses or our predicaments, where we try to self-diagnose and we come up with these reasons for the things that we do, or like maybe I was really angry because I was so hungry, or maybe I was really rude because I'm just really tired. And we come up with these physical ailments that have produced these moral bad behaviors to justify them. And so his valve is his constant justification for his morally irreputable ways of being in the world.
Yeah, so he's physically disgusting, and he just overeats and kind of lies around all day watching television or writing in bed. And he lives with his mother. It's actually unclear, like, how old is he? Do we know?
Interesting. No, you don't really have an age. And the character is not based on John Kennedy Toole himself. It was based on one of his colleagues. So it'd be interesting. I mean, I've always imagined him like early 40s.
Yeah, I mean, he's way too old to be living with his mom and, writing in his diary all day. And yeah, so let's talk about his character. So he is depraved in interesting ways. I mean, there's some uninteresting ways that he's depraved. He's a liar, for example. I mean, he's like a pathological liar. He abuses people.
Right.
He's constitutively incapable of taking responsibility for anything.
Yeah.
His valve is part of that, but then also everything is always somebody else's fault. But he also has this really quirky personality trait that he really loves to indulge in that which he purportedly hates.
Right.
Right. So he sort of gets off on judging the corruption of the world.
Yeah.
What is going on there?
Yeah. Well, I liked the gets off pun because, of course, like in the opening scene, he's like masturbating over his dead dog, which is super gross.
It is super gross. Yes.
So, and the way you describe it makes him sound like he's vicious. So if you haven't really read the novel, I mean, he's not a vicious character. His lies are these creative fictions in which he places himself in the world. But everything he's doing is somewhat of a performance, right? It has this performative aspect. Like even when he's alone in his room, writing in his diaries, he thinks he's performing for future generations to see. So there's nothing about him. I mean, it's all self-serving. Yes, it does, or seems like it's self-serving. So there's not a lot to like about him, but at the same time, you don't hate him the way you would hate Raskolnikov necessarily for, you feel like he's murderous, or that you would hate Iago because of the way he lies and manipulates people. Like there's none of that kind of evil viciousness about him. There's just a disturbing quality it's not sinister. It's just gross, it's very carnal.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say he's very lovable. You sort of feel like you're on his side, but he's vicious. I mean, he's vicious in just the ordinary way of vice, right? Like he's
Yeah.
slovenly and he's, abusive and dishonest. And I mean, those are all vices, right?
So maybe sinister is a better word than vicious. And I'm really wanting you to unpack that lovable because I find nothing about him to be lovable.
Oh, really? Maybe it's because I have someone in my life who really reminds me. I don't know. Maybe I'm just my personal baggage. Or maybe I just find absurd people lovable, which actually I kind of do. So I don't know. I mean, I find him hilarious.
Wow. I do find him hilarious, but I think that he's purposefully supposed to be testing the limits of love, right? So even you bringing up this idea of lovability, he really does test how much you can love someone. I mean, the fact that his mother is about done with him, that shows you that his entire character is like testing how much anybody could love this guy. Like he's somebody that not even a mother might be able to love anymore.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to date him, but I find him very lovable. But I don't know what that really says about me. But I mean, I don't really think we need to get into the plot so much because it's long and winding and complicated. And I mean, it really is just sort of one farce after another. And then all of it sort of comes to a head at the end. He leads a failed crusade at one point.
Yeah.
Oh, we haven't talked about how offensive he is.
Right.
That's the other thing is this is a very politically incorrect novel.
Yeah.
Should we have like a trigger warning?
Yeah.
Like every offensive term he uses, and I think uses with delight. I mean, wouldn't you say that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think he's again, there's a lot of purpose. So he looks like he's this character that's just out on this wandering where there doesn't seem to be any purpose behind what he's doing. And yet he imagines himself in like a medieval drama or like a moral play from, the Middle Ages in which he's really like playing out good and evil on this large stage. So he's offending, he's trying to offend. He's trying to like push over everything that's sacred to this capitalistic, hedonistic culture and call them out on all their problems while still indulging in the exact same vices that they're indulging in.
Yeah, that's right. No, I mean, he hates modernity, but he himself is, of course, very modern. So one of the, central texts, one of the central medieval texts that he's always drawing upon is Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. So I feel like we should talk about what Boethius's text really says and then what Ignatius J. Reilly seems to get out of it.
Yeah.
and why this text is so important to him and how it sort of functions in this novel.
Well, let me set it up for a second. So Ignatius J. Reilly thinks he's a scholar. He might remind some people of almost like a Flannery O'Connor intellectual son returning home and living with his family. Right? But then John Kennedy Toole takes it to a further extreme than O'Connor would have even gone with her characters, right? But these intellectuals, they've learned so much, but they're not practicing the virtues that are supposed to accompany the wisdom they seem to have. And so he quotes throughout this text, he's constantly quoting these grand sources that most people today haven't read. There's not a lot of people that read Joseph Addison or read Boethius anymore. And yet he quotes it as part of like his daily way of seeing the world. So we're not just like randomly pairing Boethius with Ignatius Reilly. In some sense, it's almost a gloss on that medieval story. It is how would modern people come to read Boethius's Consolation, and would it be consoling anymore the way it was at that time?
Yeah. I mean, his mother at the end says this is after she really is done with him. And I think she wants to send him to like some kind of insane asylum. And she says to him, "You learned everything, Ignatius, except how to be a human being." Right. Yeah, that seems pretty apt. She sort of sums it up very well at the end. But
Mhm.
let's talk about the real consolation of philosophy. So the setup of this, I mean, it's an interesting text because it's sort of part poetry, part philosophy. But the setup is, Boethius is going to be executed.
Mhm.
And in real life, right, he's going to be executed by Theodoric, the barbarian king in
Mhm.
Ravenna.
Mhm.
And he's like depressed and he's mad because he is going to be murdered for doing the right thing,
Mhm.
right? Or he's going to be executed for doing the right thing. And he's like, well, Plato taught me that virtue would benefit me, but look at me now, right? I'm languishing in a dungeon by
Mhm.
myself
Yeah.
awaiting my execution. This is stupid, you know? So he's feeling like very down, understandably,
Mhm.
kind of feeling like he got gypped,
Mhm. Mhm.
by falling for that philosophy stuff. And then this astonishing figure appears to him, Lady Philosophy. So let's talk about Lady Philosophy and what she says to Boethius.
Sure. Well, and then the setup, of course, I mean, he's in prison and he's writing poetry at first, which I think is important both for
Mm-hmm.
Confederacy of Dunces, but also what you're talking about with Plato. Because at the end, when everyone gathers around Socrates and he's about to drink hemlock, what is he doing? A man who wrote philosophy his whole life is like writing poetry. So you had
Mm-hmm.
Boethius imitating that model and writing poetry. I guess this is what you do when you're about to die as an innocent victim of the system that is unjust, right? And instead,
Yeah.
Lady Philosophy descends and is like, get those poetic sluts out of this prison cell.
Yes. Yeah, and she calls them sluts. She's like, get these whores, these muses out of here. Yeah.
Yeah, and so she basically just says that that's not the way to go right now. I mean, she really
Hmm.
overturns Socrates and says, what did Socrates do his whole life? Let's go back to that. Like, let's go back to the examining our life. What were you here for? And so she gives him almost like a catechism, right?
Hmm.
It's not religious, but it's this, okay, so what do you still remember? What do you still know? What do you still live by? And he's like getting all these questions wrong.
Uh-huh.
Right. And the dialogue, I think, is important too when you look at Confederacy, and we can go back to that in a minute. But she becomes this interlocutor with him,
Hmm.
right? This high voice that has been revealed to him, that comes down to him and tries to lead him back to what it is that he's supposed to know and be living by.
Right. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me about this text is that Lady Philosophy comes to him as a physician.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, you're sick. And she diagnoses him with amnesia.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, Boethius, you've forgotten everything I've taught you. Good Lord. And so now let me help you try to recollect what you already know. And I think it's the third book where she's talking about Fortuna, right?
Mm-hmm.
And which comes up all the time in this novel. And it's sort of, I mean, it's basically Fortune's Wheel.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say Wheel of Fortune because Americans can only hear that as a really bad 80s game show. But like Fortune has this wheel that's like constantly turning, and you can be either you can either be on the top and like you're king of the world and everything's great. But then the wheel keeps spinning and she just crushes you like a bug, and you never really know where you're going to come out there. And this becomes really important for Ignatius J.
Mm-hmm.
Reilly. But the thing is, like, if you just keep reading, right, the whole setup is a contrast between fortune on the one hand, because
Mm-hmm.
Boethius thinks he just has had bad luck or something. And she reminds him, no, 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 right? There's no bad luck in some sense because this is all in accordance with providence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this contrast between fortune and providence, a kind of divine plan, according to which somehow Boethius is being executed is,
Mm-hmm.
part of the plan
Yeah.
and therefore good, right?
Well, she reminds him of the kind of the not lackluster, because it's very appealing to think about fortune, but fortune is what will lie to him, right? So good fortune, I think that she actually says this, good fortune deceives, bad fortune enlightens. So
Mm-hmm.
right now he's been falling for fortune being in control because everything was going his direction.
Yeah.
Actually, that's when you're not living according to the truth. And when you're in this place of suffering, suddenly you see things more clearly. That you see that it's not just about good fortune being in control. And this is important for Ignatius because he, of course, keeps saying, "Oh, Fortuna, you're crushing me beneath your will." Well, if he was actually reading Boethius well, he'd realize if he's being crushed, then he's being shown the truth of things. Like he'll be able to see things better, not he's therefore like suffering at the hand of this fate and he's in a place of darkness or a pit. So he's not reading Boethius correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. So, no, he's clearly not reading Boethius correctly. And I wonder about the upshot of that, in the novel. So you've written this paper, which you sent me, called "The Literary Foolishness of Ignatius Reilly," which I guess is forthcoming.
It's already out. So it's in it's a chapter in a book called Theology and Geometry that came out either 2019 or 2020. I don't remember. 2020 is a blur, but it's somewhere. It came out in somewhere in there.
Gotcha. Yeah. And yeah, why don't you just tell us what your main thesis is in this paper, since it bears on this?
Sure. Yeah. It's this idea that Ignatius, who wants to be a writer, cannot actually be a reader because he reads everything with just one voice, with one perspective. And therefore, and really it's a stance of pride that he takes on all these different texts. And by taking this stance of pride, he's missing learning from any of the things that he ever read. So even the lady philosophy in his life, which is Myrna Minkanov, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so she's always addressing the problems of the age. She's writing letters to him, and yet he always is dismissing even her letters. So even this chance that he could have to have an interlocutor, a lady philosophy that came and enlightened him through a dialogue, he shuts down. So my argument is that he's constantly shutting down these other voices that would allow him to get out of the silo of himself and become a human being, as his mother says, enter society as a human person, enter into a community with other people. Even both living and dead. The dead that he reveres, he's not even actually in communion with because he cuts off parts of their text for his epigrams. He doesn't read the whole thing. He doesn't apply it to his own life. And so he's just unable to do anything other than just perform for himself this monologic life that he wants to live.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, what do you think? I guess I'm sort of just tempted to say, look, this novel won the Pulitzer Prize, right? It's supposed to be a really good novel. What is Toole trying to say in this novel when you just cut through all of the just hysterics and all of the really smart, we've been emphasizing how funny it is, but it's also incredibly brilliant. It's clear that a very literate man wrote this novel. And I think you could enjoy this novel not picking up on any of that stuff because it's just objectively hilarious and funny. But if you're kind of tuned in to the ways that it's also clever and sophisticated, right? But what is he trying to do in this novel?
So I think it's kind of a contemporary Ecclesiastes, right?
Okay, say more.
Yeah. So Ecclesiastes opens by saying absurdity of absurdities, or the literal translation of the Hebrew would be breath, mere breath. It's not the same. It's hevel. It's not the same word as like the breath of God, which moves within us, the providence that Lady Philosophy was talking about, the meaningful breath that gives you purpose, right? Instead, it's the gaseous breath of Ignatius Reilly. And he is the preacher or the teacher assembling this collection of knowledge that seems at odds. Some voices say this, some voices say this, and he just puts them all in contrast until he's like exhaling nothingness, right? Totally gaseous, absurd. And then the book ends almost with a point back to fear God in a weird way because he's being rescued.
Yes, he is rescued in the end.
He's rescued in the end. And he rolls down the window and he says that the air is purgative,
Mm-hmm.
which I love. So he's actually breathing in the wind, which is ruah. That's the Hebrew word for the breath of God, is the wind. He's actually breathing in this purgative wind at the end to replace all of his gaseous absurdity that he has just assembled throughout the novel, and finding maybe there is a providence, like Lady Philosophy said, or maybe there is a meaningful breath in the world. So it just kind of, it points to that. If you want to think about the novel itself almost like a genre on a wheel. Louise Cowan would talk about these different genres all cycling into one another, and always move from tragedy into the great comedy. Even if it only points that that's the next place on the wheel, you see that it's turning there. And I think that that's what this novel does, is it kind of points us there, or it looks like it's going to move toward comedy. But he doesn't ever get to that moment in this book.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a comedy in the traditional sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a comedy in the modern sense, that it's hilarious. But yeah, I mean, but it's also, isn't it also kind of satire? I mean, it does open up with this just fabulous quote from Jonathan Swift, right? Which is, when a true genius appears in the world, you may know him by this sign, that the dunces are all in confederacy against him, right? Which is sort of, I mean, the degree to which this is perfect is hard to overstate, because, you know, Ignatius thinks he's a genius, and he's not. He's really not a genius. And but it's also true in a sense that the dunces are in confederacy against him.
Yes. I think that's what makes the novel so funny, is every time he actually tries to do some sort of good, that ends up being so funny. I mean, when he does, one of my favorite scenes, of course, is when he tries to gather all the people who aren't being treated right at the factory. And so he tries this whole revolt, and like to first get.
Oh, this is the crusade for
the crusade.
Yes.
And like anybody who's been reading all the same stuff that Ignatius has been reading, in your head, you might be thinking like Ulysses gathering the troops on his ship, you know, to go sail out, or some grand speech that someone's going to give and everyone's going to follow the lead. And that's how he casts himself in that role. And instead, he's like up there trying to get on their side by liking jazz. And so you have this huge, obese man standing on these railings of the factory, white man trying to stand in front of a black employees, and he's dancing to jazz and saying, do it, baby. And you can just imagine, I mean, it's hilarious. It's not a call to arms. It's not a move towards social justice. It's a parody of this man's attempt to so-called rescue people. Right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, no, he really does fancy himself as some kind of genius, as some kind of savior, as some kind of prophet, you know, if only people would listen to him. Like, on the one hand, you know, it's obviously absurd, but then on the other hand, Ignatius really is onto something, right? There is something deeply wrong with the world that he sees, right?
The people he's trying to help in the factory, they should not be treated the way they've been treated. I mean, there is truth there. It's the same with the queer mob in New Orleans. He wants to gather them all together, right? All of these people who so-called have been outcast by society. It's 1980, right? So they can't, you know, necessarily be themselves. And so he dresses up like a pirate because he feels like that costume will make him look like one of them. So there's just a major satire here, and yet they don't hear his call to embrace what he's offering. They laugh at him and they find him silly. And so he is constantly trying to do these good deeds, but of course never from a pure place, and always with humorous consequences.
Yeah, so there's a woman that he's having correspondence with throughout the entire novel, who also is a very absurd, you know, over the top sort of figure. She is someone who is also like a critic of the world, but from a totally different direction. Like, she is very committed, progressive. I think she's I think she's a communist.
It sounds
Yeah.
like it. Yeah.
Yeah. And, and she also has these goofy ideas about sexual liberation. So she just thinks like, oh, if everyone were just, sexually free, like they would just be so ecstatically happy and have no problems. And so she's constantly, like just trying to get Ignatius, well, one, to leave his mother's house, which seems like the right impulse, but two, to really get over his sexual hangups. And, it is really weird because on the one hand, like he thinks he's a celibate or he's some kind of champion of chastity. And, but on the other hand, he's like a habitual masturbator. So it's like really. So again, he's just like this giant contradiction. So they have this this hysterical correspondence throughout the whole novel. And then finally in the end, she comes, like, I think she sort of recognizes that he's in some kind of crisis, right? And she's gonna come save him. I've never really quite known what to make of this because I've never really quite known what to make of her. So help me out there. I don't really know what to make of her.
Well, I feel like everyone in the novel is always trying to fix things or get things right, but none of them have philosophy. Like none of them have wisdom that would actually help them respond to problems well. Does that make sense? So,
Yes.
the patrolman Manusco, who's just going to follow according to the law. And then there's who thinks sexual liberation is the answer to things. And then Ignatius, who thinks the medieval route is the right way to go. But he's missing what it is that made the medievals so great, which was namely their faith. He can't just be this pretend monk when he doesn't believe in the God they believed in. That doesn't make any sense. That's kind of like hollowed out. And again, then it just becomes a performance. So Myrna is trying to, really become a savior for him. And she does. It's the end of a medieval, Marie de France, where the knight rides in and carries away the damsel. She plays that role now. She rides in and carries Ignatius out of this problem. Only in this case, she's actually not saving him because I think he'd be better off if he was in a place of charity. I mean, it's called a charity hospital, right? Like that's where he would be better off than in the hands of this woman that doesn't know any more than he does. And if you wanted to write your own ending of the novel, you can imagine like the two of them, like they probably stop on the side of the road in less than 5 minutes of driving away. Are already at odds and already, all of the animosity you've seen between them is going to like come to broil. So it's not a novel that like ends happily ever after with them driving into the sunset or anything.
No, but it does end. I sort of thought you were saying earlier that you thought it ended on a hopeful note.
Yeah, I still think so. Just the idea that someone, as you said earlier, we find him lovable. I don't. I do think he actually tests the limits of love. But the very fact that he's unlovable and still deserves her charity or rescuing, and that sense of being rescued by another person for a moment takes him out of himself, where he says twice at the end in the last paragraph, says grateful twice. And like reflecting on this new feeling of gratitude that he's never experienced. So I do think there's hope. I'm just not sure that it's a happily ever after kind of hope.
Well, so you said, what's missing is faith. And I think that's interesting because it's a question about both texts. I mean, there's a lot of questions about the consolation of philosophy, right? What sort of text that is. And the first question that you always get when you teach the consolation of philosophy, or it's really like the first question you probably ask yourself as a reader is, if Boethius is a Christian, like a really committed Christian and not just a Christian of convenience, because that's the way things went in the Roman Empire, which of course is a theory. I mean, there are plenty of scholars who think, that Boethius was really just a pagan at the end of the day. I don't have that view, but that's a view. And, people are inclined to this view because when Boethius is dying, he's not consoled by Christ.
Mm-hmm.
He's not consoled by what theology has taught him. And he did write theology, like he wrote on the Trinity. I mean, it's not like he just didn't know it. He's consoled by philosophy, right? Not faith. Because what Lady Philosophy tells him about providence and about divine foreknowledge and freedom are things that she thinks can be known by reason. There's no, I mean, there's no revelation, strictly speaking, in the Consolation of Philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a question about faith in that text, but then there's also a question about faith in this novel, because on the one hand, you know, Ignatius J. Reilly was a rad trad before it was cool. And he's constantly, you know, like he has this kind of spiritual pride. And it's one of the ways that he abuses his mother. You know, like he's always like, oh, you know, you need to go to confession for this. And what? They only gave you 2 Hail Marys. And, you know, he's constantly like berating his mother. He doesn't ever seem to like go to mass or go to confession himself or even pray. So what really is faith to him besides another rejection of modernity?
Yeah, I know. And I don't think he has it. I think that's what really ties these works together and also ties them with Ecclesiastes. Because a lot of people feel like Ecclesiastes doesn't fit scripture. It doesn't ever refer to Yahweh. Like the text itself, even when it ends and says fear God, it uses Elohim, which is like, can also be the gods or the fates. Right? So all 3 of those texts are pointing out something true about the world, that it seems to be absurd. And it doesn't, you know, they're showing this hole, this gap, this absence that needs to be filled by something. And that's where they get to. They get to the need for revelation, the need for something other than what their reason can get to, because reason seems to lead them towards only this high. And it points that there must be something higher. So I feel like it is a very like via negativa, like there's this empty spot, there's this pointing that should be, and not any of those 3 texts actually get there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, because it sort of goes back to my question of like what Kennedy Toole is trying to do with this novel, because it's a novel that takes place in a very Catholic city, right? That draws on this kind of rich Catholic literary tradition that has this central figure that's like this abusive rad trad who rejects modernity. But like, what is he really saying about it at the end of the day?
Yeah. Well, and I think he's trying these things out. So in the same way, you know, what is the meaning of life? That's the biggest question of all, right? Like, what is the purpose of all this? What's the point? And you have this text in which this man supposedly we're reading all of these sources from tradition where he should have been asking that question. And the only thing he gets to is himself. And I can't help thinking about Ecclesiastes where he's like, I'm going to try to build gardens. I'm going to try to sleep with lots of concubines. I'm going to get drunk on wine a lot and see what happens. And then Ignatius Reilly is very similar to that. I'm going to eat 1,000 hot dogs and see if that makes me happy. Right? I'm going to try all these different ways of being.
Does he really intend to eat all those hot dogs, or does it just kind of happen? I feel like it just kind of happens, you know? Like he gets nervous and he's just like, oh God, I ate like 5 more hot dogs and my valve is erupting.
It's so gross because you can imagine like, you know, the way that people normally eat. It's like, maybe I could eat more jelly beans than I meant to because they're tiny. Hot dogs, like, like the gag reflex of this book. And, you know, Walker Percy used to say, he wrote Lancelot kind of in the hopes that your gag reflex would be put on, that it is so bad that the sin is there, that maybe you would realize sin is actually a bad thing. And in some ways, this performance by Ignatius Reilly is so gross, right? It's the extreme version of the sins all of us participate in all the time, right? It takes it to the extreme, but it is also telling the truth about things and the way we are.
Yeah. I mean, so for people who don't like this novel, which I don't get, but they're definitely out there. They have outed themselves on Twitter. I won't name names. But some of them are serious literary types.
Mhm.
I mean, what do you say to someone who just like doesn't get it? How would you advertise this novel as a classic, as
Mhm.
something really worth reading and thinking about, and not just like enjoying? Because we obviously both agree that it's immensely enjoyable. But suppose that you didn't enjoy it. Why should you still take it seriously as great literature? Like, why is it a great book?
One, I think because it joins the tradition, right? It doesn't exist in a vacuum. The book is responding to hundreds, even thousands of years of people asking, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of things? And
Mm-hmm.
he draws all those traditions, those authors, those writers, those ways of being in the world into the text, and doesn't try to just come up with something as though none of that tradition has ever happened. And I love that. I love that there's all these layers to the novel, that the more you dig, you don't find like, oh, I dug and I pulled at this thread and then there was nothing there. I feel like every time I dig at a thread in this novel, I realize there was more to it than I saw on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me says that it's a pretty great work, right? If you're actually pulling and pulling and you discover more things. One of the arguments that I kind of pulled out for a little while was trying to see him as a holy fool.
I didn't totally get that. So let's talk about that. Because yeah, why would you think he's a holy fool?
The idea of the holy fool in Russian tradition would be that someone performed all the sins of a community in their region, like in their city. And then you stone them, you outcast them. And in that sense, they become kind of like an inverse of Jesus. Like he literally takes the sin upon himself by sinning.
Mm.
And then is outcast by the society the way that innocent Jesus would have been.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? So Ignatius Reilly is performing for the community, and then they get to cast him out. So he kind of plays this role. The question, I mean, there's lots of ways he doesn't too, which I think also makes it a really great book, is that there's no allegory, there's no just one type or one way to read Ignatius. But once you start reading him that way, you realize there's more depth to the novel than you may have first seen, because then you have to start asking some of these questions, the ways that he fits and doesn't fit, and why not, right? Is there room left in the 21st century for holy fools to even exist, right? Or will we just see them as sinful people among us, or would we just see them as outcasts or something?
I'm interested in what its critical reception was. So, I mean, I know that it's critically acclaimed, but I'm curious what people made of it.
Or
Do you know?
I don't know its 80s reception. I know that still now there's only a very small cult following with this book. It's not something.
See, I mean, I feel like down here in the South, everyone's read it. At least all the men I meet have read it.
That would be probably true. Like it kind of hits the same buttons as like a David Foster Wallace or a Kurt Vonnegut or Walker Percy. Like it's that same group that really likes it. Whereas, a lot of the people that I'm probably around, like English professors reading Jane Austen, are not into this novel, right? They would, I mean, I love Parents Follow Prior, but I can't imagine that she would have ever read this book or want to read this book.
Oh, well, now we'll have to ask her what she thinks of the Confederacy. I'm curious.
Well, and that's why
it's so smart. I feel like she would like it. It's just so smart.
It's different. It's a different taste. It's a different kind of palette. So what the book is doing is very different from Jane Austen. Like Jane Austen, it's really hard to disagree with Jane Austen. Like that people should be nice to one another, and that you should have manners in society, and that you shouldn't chase after wealth, and that marriage is a good thing. And I mean, it's just really hard to feel like you've been pressed out of your boundaries.
I just think it's mad and brilliant.
Yes.
And absolutely hysterical. And Ignatius J. Reilly is someone who just stays with you. And yeah, I mean, this is really helpful. There's a lot to think about. But I guess of all the threads here, the one that appeals to me the most is the idea that, it's a novel that's calling you to see things in a deeper way, right? And it seems, while it's true, it's obviously true that
Mhm.
Ignatius J. Reilly has had some sort of profound miseducation, you know, which probably, I mean, let's get real, like we all have
Mhm.
had some
Mhm.
profound miseducation, but his seems to be very deep. And what's impressive about it is that it seems to be a miseducation of great books,
Mhm.
right? So it's not like Madame Bovary where he was just raised on
Right,
crap.
right,
And
right.
so like you were fed a diet of crap and now you can't love anyone.
That's
Okay.
the point. Yeah,
Right. This is not his problem.
right.
He wasn't fed a diet of crap, right? He was given like a literary feast,
Mhm.
which he in some sense internalized, but in the wrong way.
Well, and that's you're so hitting on something. I mean, that is the problem. It's he approached absolutely everything with a sense of pride.
Hmm.
He was just pulling from it as he needed, which is the same thing he does in his life. He uses people like he uses books. He has that same approach. And so his whole inner life, even the idea where he keeps saying, I have a rich inner life, I have a rich inner life. But I still need as many hot dogs as possible. I still need the comforts of life. Like, well, you don't have a rich
Always
inner life.
capitalized.
Yeah,
Always capitalized. I have a very rich inner life.
it's a product. It's a product to be consumed. And so you're definitely hitting on it. It's not a matter of what you read necessarily. It is in part. Look at the difference between Bovary, right?
Hmm.
That's a good point. It is partially content, but the other part of it has to be how you read these things.
Hmm.
And that's the education he missed. He never saw how to read with humility or how
Hmm.
to live differently after you read a book. He read
Hmm.
things to consume them and use them.
Yeah, right. And then to like lord it over others. I mean, I think it was a way of being superior because, like everybody else in the novel, except for Myrna, is not educated really at all,
Mhm.
right? And so it's a kind of a way of, I don't know, making himself seem better than them.
Even his attempts at social justice, he's always standing above, right? He stands on tables, he stands
Hmm.
up above people to try to lift them up, but it's only to be lifted up underneath him.
Hmm.
He's never below them, lifting them up in his place, right? So it's
Hmm.
always still a problem. It's the same way he approached the text, standing above it and pulling from it,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. One last question. Maybe it's my last question. So the other people in this novel are all very weird and
Mhm.
comical and also bad.
Mhm.
So like they're all kind of bad people in their own weird
Mhm.
way. What is going on there?
The fact that you don't have any good people, you mean?
Yeah, there's nobody. Is there anyone in this novel that is good? Like maybe Trixie? I don't know.
No, no, I don't think that there is. I think there are aspects of different characters that have goodness in them. Patrolman Manusco is
Hmm.
probably one of the better characters. Um,
Hmm.
and yet he's still limited because there's no creativity to the man, but he's loving, he's law abiding,
Hmm.
generous, he's charitable. Like, he's probably the best character
Hmm.
in the work, maybe.
Because I guess I'm just wondering, like, in all of his interactions with other people, right? I mean, they don't really seem meaningfully better than him.
No, what I'm wondering, so there's that great line that Tim Keller always says where he's like, you are, I'm going to get it wrong and butcher it, but it's like, you are worse than you can ever imagine,
Hmm.
but you're also more loved than you can ever imagine, which
Hmm.
I think is what this novel is doing. All these characters somehow, there's love between characters.
Hmm.
There's good relation, right? Like relationships actually happen. People care about other people. People make changes in their lives.
Hmm.
And so they're still good, even though they're all horrible. There's every single one of them, not one of them is without sin.
Hmm. Right. So I recently read, I think somebody was maybe in the New Yorker, somebody was like trying to cancel this book. Did you see that?
Oh, I did not. I wish you would have said that.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just I mean, look, this book would be so easy to cancel, right? It's incredibly offensive. But like,
But it's not.
but way to miss the point,
Yeah,
right?
it's
Because
not
it's like, of course this guy is offensive. That's part of the whole
right. Yeah.
like
Oh,
yeah, we're not allowed to
yeah.
love a Confederacy of Dunces.
See, I mean, I think
Um,
this is the problem.
which I mean, talk about the problem of not being able to read, as if Ignatius J. Reilly is supposed to be a moral exemplar,
Right.
right?
I mean, yes, also please go masturbate over your dead dog because that's the point of the work. Like, what in the world are you missing? No, you're not supposed to imitate him. If you went away, it's like if people watch Mad Men and then decided to be Don Draper. It's like, did you completely miss the point of Mad Men? Right? Like, that's not the point, is to imitate these horrible characters.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, that's
Wow.
I did not know that, but that makes me really angry at our culture and makes me want to write a book on how to read.
Yes. Well, it's a perennial problem.
If I had to create a bookshelf of like the books I would take to a desert island, this is on it.
Really?
Yeah, it is. Like, it is one of my top 15, 20. I mean, it's in, maybe I'm trying to decide if it's in the top 10, but I'd have to go through my list, but it's at least in my top 15 or 20 books that I would bring.
Do you teach it?
I have taught it one time and it did
Okay, because
it got go over well.
I can't imagine teaching this. I have no idea. Like,
I think if I could teach it now, I would teach it in conjunction with Percy's Lost in the Cosmos.
oh, really? Why?
Because I think it sets us up for the way that Percy goes through all of our different sacred cows. This is what the world means. This is what life is about. And then like leaves everything blank except for God. I think that the novel then is an embodiment of that philosophy that's more explicit and Lost in the Cosmos. That we don't know who we are. Like the same way you were talking about with Boethius, like you've lost yourself. You've forgotten yourself. It's like self-amnesia. Ignatius Reilly embodies that. When his mom says you've learned everything except for how to be a human being. We've lost what it is that we are. And so I could set students up with that whole context and then show them what it looks like to have lost this sense of who we are and why we're here.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because, yeah, in a way, he hasn't lost his sense of who we are because he has this patina of religion, right? He has this kind of rad trad Catholic thing going, but it's all in his head. And it doesn't make it out of his head.
Well,
it doesn't penetrate into his heart. It doesn't penetrate into his actions. It doesn't like there is no charity. And like he thinks the world needs charity. There is no charity in him. He thinks the world needs faith. There is really no faith in him. And
I would say this is why he's lost the sense of who he is, right? Whereas Percy is going to say this mind-body split is ignoring the tertium quid, which is like our soul. So we are minds, bodies, and souls. And Ignatius Reilly only lives for his body or lives for his mind. And he has this sense that we're supposed to have this moral soul here, that he's forgotten what it is. And it's a soul that has to be defined in relationship, right? Human beings, this is Percy, are really stealing from de Lubac. Human beings are persons defined by other persons. You're a mother. That's a relationship that's defining you. You're a wife, right? Your identity is not a solo achievement that you get to create ex nihilo. Your identity is a relational thing, and he's missing that part. And that's why the key at the very end of the novel that is so purgative for him is gratitude. Gratitude cannot be experienced alone. It takes another person that you are grateful to, or you're grateful to God.
That's right. And at the end, doesn't he finally doesn't something happen with his valve at the end?
Oh, now I can't remember.
I think it does. Well, something's always happening to his valve. On Twitter, I wanted to rename this novel Great Erectations. Yeah, I thought that was kind of clever myself. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. This is like the penultimate paragraph. Myrna prodded and shifted the Renault through the city traffic masterfully, weaving in and out of impossibly narrow lanes until they were clear of the last twinkling streetlight of the last swampy suburb. Then they were in darkness in the center of the salt marshes. Ignatius looked out at the highway marker that reflected their headlights, US 11. The marker flew past. He rolled down the window an inch or two and breathed the salt air, blowing in over the marshes from the Gulf. As if the air were a purgative, his valve opened.
Mm-hmm.
He breathed again, this time more deeply. The dull headache was lifting, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, maybe his valve is opened now, right? Which I mean is a very material bodily thing. Anyway, I can't thank you enough for talking with me. Sorry. I can't thank you enough for talking with me about this amazing novel because, there's a sense in which I feel like I need help better understanding this. And now I feel like I do. So, So I am grateful, speaking of gratitude.
I was going to say, I feel like you just proved the entire point of the book, right? Which is supposed to be, we're defined in community. Reading should not just be a monologic experience, isolated, but it should be more open.
There you go. I love it that your dog is finally barking. Hello, what is your dog's name?
Toller is like Tolkien.
Okay. Of course your dog isn't named like Buster or something.
Yep. Tolkien.
Gotta have a pretentious name. That's amazing. Jessica, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Always a pleasure.
Thanks.
You have been listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a philosophy and theology podcast that is generously underwritten by the Institute of Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and produced by Catholics for Hire, a group of young Catholic digital content freelancers. You can subscribe to the podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spotify, or on the app Lyceum. And you can also follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at EudaimoniaPod, and we're also on Facebook at Sacred and Profane Love. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Just go over to www.patreon.com/EudaimoniaPod to become a monthly patron as we head into our 4th season. For our next episode, I'll be joined by Nick Rapatrazone to discuss the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Until then, friends, be well and keep reading.